My name is Lena, and I'm 68 years old. I never thought I'd find myself here speaking to you with my heart still aching the echo of my son's words, cutting deeper than I can bear. Mom, we're selling your jewelry for the baby David, said his voice cold like he was reading a grocery list. He stood in the doorway of my bedroom, a room that's mine in name only, since this house belongs to him and Sarah now. My hands clutched the velvet box holding my mother's sapphire necklace, the one she wore when she married my father, the one I wore when I married mine. Tears stung my eyes, blurring the deep blue of the stone, but David just sighed, his patience thin. It's just old stuff, Mom. The baby's future matters more. Sarah, my daughter-in-law, stood behind him, nodding, her lips pressed tight like she was biting back something bitter. I tried to speak to tell them what those jewels meant, love, memory, a life, but my voice cracked. And then David laughed, a short, cruel sound like a door slamming shut. "Don't be dramatic," he said. "You don't need them anymore. You don't need them anymore." Those words weren't just about the jewelry, they were about me, my place in their home, their lives. I was the woman who raised David, who kissed his scraped knees, who stayed up nights when he had a fever. I was the one who held him when his father died, who sold my own car to help pay for his college. But now to him, I was just old stuff, a burden, something to be dealt with, like a chair they hadn't bothered to throw out. I've lived in their guest room for 3 years, ever since my husband Tom passed, and the hospital bills devoured our savings. David offered me. The room said it was the least he could do. I was grateful, or at least I thought I was. I didn't want to be alone, and I believed naively, I know now, that living with my son would mean family, warmth. Instead, it's been a slow fading. Sarah's sharp exhales when I leave a cup in the sink. David's clipped answers when I ask about his day. The way they murmur about me when they think I'm asleep, their voices seeping through the walls. "She's too slow," Sarah said once. "She's in the way." I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering when I became a ghost in my own life. The jewelry was my last piece of myself. Not because it's worth money, though some of it is, but because it's mine. My mother's sapphire necklace, my grandmother's emerald ring, the pearl earrings Tom gave me on our 10th anniversary. Each piece carries a story, a moment, when I was seen cherished. When David said they'd sell it, it wasn't just about losing those treasures. It was about losing me. The me who danced at her wedding, who laughed with her husband, who felt like she belonged somewhere. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, the velvet box still in my hands, and I wept. Quietly so they wouldn't hear, so they wouldn't laugh again. The next morning, I woke with a weight in my chest, heavy as a stone. I made my coffee in silence, avoiding Sarah's eyes as she scrolled on her phone at the kitchen table. David was already gone off to his job at the bank, the one he brags about. I thought about pleading with them, begging them to let me keep the jewelry, but the memory of David's laugh stopped me. Instead, I went back to my room and opened the safe. It's a small one hidden under the bed, where I keep my jewelry and a few papers. I took out the sapphire necklace and held it up, watching the light dance across its surface. It felt warm, like it carried my mother's voice urging me to be strong. But I wasn't strong, not then. I was just broken. I barely left my room that week. Sarah knocked once, asking if I was okay, but her voice was more irritated than worried. I said I was fine, and she didn't press. I spent hours looking through old photos, ones I kept in a shoebox under the bed. Pictures of David as a boy, his smile gap-toothed and bright. Pictures of Tom and me on our honeymoon, young and reckless with love. Pictures of my parents, my sister, a life that felt so full once. Each photo was a shard of who I used to be, and it hurt to hold them, but I couldn't stop. It was like I was searching for evidence that I'd been real, that I still was. One afternoon, I overheard Sarah on the phone in the living room, her voice hushed but sharp. "She's just hoarding all that jewelry," she said. "It's selfish, honestly. We could use it for the baby's college fund or the new house we're eyeing." I froze my fingers, tightening around a photo of David's 5th birthday, his face sticky with cake. Selfish. The word seared me. I'd given them everything, my time, my love, my pride. And now I was selfish for wanting to hold on to the last fragments of my heart. I don't know why that moment hit differently, why it stirred something when so many others hadn't. Maybe it was Sarah's tone, so careless, like my pain was a nuisance. Maybe it was the photo reminding me of the boy who used to run to me. Whatever it was, I felt a spark. Tiny, fragile, but real. I set the photo down and opened the safe again. This time, I didn't just look at the jewelry. I looked at the papers beneath it. The ones I hadn't touched in years. The ones David and Sarah didn't know existed. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something besides grief. I felt possibility. I didn't act on it right away. I was too scared, too used to burying my hurt. But that spark lingered glowing in the quiet moments. I started listening more closely, really hearing how David and Sarah spoke about me. The way they planned their future without asking what I wanted, what I needed. The way they assumed I was just a shadow, someone who'd fade when they were done with me. And the more I listened, the more I realized they didn't know me at all. They didn't know the woman who'd raised a son alone after her husband died. They didn't know the woman who'd stretched pennies and mended hearts and kept going when the world was too heavy. They didn't know about the second vault. It's strange, isn't it? How the people you love most can see you the least. That safe under my bed wasn't the only one I had. There was another hidden in the back of the closet behind a panel Tom built before he passed. He'd called it our, just in case, a place for the things that mattered most. I hadn't opened it since his funeral, hadn't had the courage to face what was inside. But that day, after hearing Sarah's voice, I knelt on the floor, my knees creaking, and pried the panel loose. The vault was still there, small and plain, its combination locked in my memory. I turned the dial with trembling hands, and when the door clicked open, I saw it. Not just jewelry, though there was that, too. A diamond brooch, a gold locket, pieces I'd forgotten I'd kept. But beneath them were papers, documents, the kind that change everything. I won't tell you what they were not yet. I wasn't ready to face their power myself, but holding them, reading the words in Tom's steady handwriting, I felt something shift. It wasn't just about the jewelry anymore. It was about my life, my worth, my place in this world. And for the first time in years, I started to believe I could claim it back. The days after I opened the second vault were strange, like I was waking up from a long, heavy sleep. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Not David, not Sarah, not even my sister Clara, who lives 3 states away and calls me every Sunday. The papers stayed in the vault, their weight pressing on my mind, but I wasn't ready to act. Not yet. I was still too raw, too used to shrinking myself to fit into their lives. But that spark I'd felt, that tiny flicker of possibility, it wouldn't go out. It grew quiet but stubborn in the moments when I was alone, when the house was still, and I could hear my own thoughts again. I started noticing things I'd ignored before. The way Sarah would leave the room when I tried to talk about my day, her phone always more interesting than me. The way David would cut me off if I mentioned Tom, like my memories were an inconvenience. Once I overheard them in the kitchen, their voices low but clear. "We need to think about the long term," David said. "She can't stay here forever." Sarah murmured something I couldn't catch, but her tone was sharp, final. I stood in the hallway, my hand on the wall to steady myself, and felt the stone in my chest grow heavier. They weren't just talking about selling my jewelry. They were talking about selling me, my place, my presence, my right to exist in their world. I don't know how to explain what that did to me. It wasn't just hurt, it was a kind of unraveling. I'd spent my life building a family, pouring my heart into David, into Tom, into the home we'd made together. And now, to be discussed like a problem to be solved, it made me feel small, disposable. But it also made me angry. Not the loud shouting kind of anger, I've never been that woman, but a quiet, burning kind, the kind that simmers under the surface and changes you. I started doing small things they wouldn't notice, but that felt like reclaiming pieces of myself. I'd wear my mother's emerald ring when I went to the grocery store, its weight on my finger reminding me I was still here. I'd hum Tom's favorite song while I folded laundry, even if Sarah rolled her eyes. I'd sit by the window with my coffee and let myself really remember the woman I used to be. One morning, I decided to walk to the library. It's only a mile away, but I hadn't gone in months. Sarah always said it was easier to order books online, and I'd stopped arguing. That day, though, I needed to get out to breathe air that wasn't thick with their disapproval. The walk was slow, my hips aching with every step, but the autumn air was crisp, and the leaves crunched under my shoes. I felt alive, like I was moving through the world instead of just existing in it. At the library, I wandered the stacks, running my fingers along the spines of books I'd loved years ago. Jane Austen, Toni Morrison books that had made me feel seen when I was younger. I checked out a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice and sat in a corner reading until my eyes blurred. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a choice I'd made for myself. That's where I met Rose. She was shelving books, her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun, her smile warm when she saw me struggling to reach a high shelf. "Need a hand?" she asked, and before I could answer, she'd pulled down the book I wanted. We got to talking about books at first, then about life. She was 72, a retired teacher who volunteered at the library because she loved the quiet. There was something about her, a steadiness that made me feel safe. I didn't tell her everything, not about David or Sarah or the jewelry, but I told her enough. How I felt like a guest in my own son's home. How I wasn't sure where I fit anymore. She listened. Really. Listened, her eyes soft, but not pitying. "Lena." She said, "You're not just someone's mother or someone's burden. You're you. Don't let anyone make you forget that." Her words stayed with me like a melody I couldn't shake. I started going to the library more often, not just to read, but to see Rose. We'd sit in the corner sharing tea from her thermos, talking about the lives we'd lived. She told me about her husband gone 10 years now and her daughter who lived abroad and rarely called. I told her about Tom, about the way he'd make me laugh until my sides hurt, about the hole he'd left when he died. I even told her about the jewelry, though I didn't mention the second vault. She didn't judge or offer quick fixes. She just listened, and somehow that was enough to make me feel a little less alone. Those library visits became my lifeline. They were small, but they were mine, and they reminded me that I could still choose things for myself. I started other small acts, too. I called Clara one evening, not waiting for her usual Sunday call. We talked for hours, laughing about old memories, crying about the ones that hurt. I bought a new scarf at the thrift store, bright red, and wore it even though Sarah said it was too loud. I started writing in a notebook, just thoughts and memories, things I didn't want to forget. Each choice felt like a brick, slowly building something solid inside me, something they couldn't take away. But the hurt was still there, sharp and unrelenting. One evening, I came home from the library to find Sarah in my room, standing by the safe. My heart stopped. She wasn't touching it, just looking, but the sight of her there in my space felt like a violation. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I meant. She flinched, then shrugged. "Just checking if you needed anything organized. This room's a mess." It wasn't a mess, and we both knew it. She left without another word, but the air felt heavy, like a storm was coming. That night, I moved the safe to the closet behind some boxes and checked the second vault to make sure it was still hidden. It was. But the fear stayed gnawing at me. They weren't just dismissing me now. They were circling like vultures, waiting for me to give up. I thought about confronting them, about telling them to leave my things alone, but I knew how it would go. David would laugh, Sarah would roll her eyes, and I'd be left feeling smaller than before. Instead, I kept going to the library, kept talking to Rose, kept writing in my notebook. and I started thinking about the papers in the second vault. Not just what they were, but what they meant. They weren't just documents. They were power. Proof that I wasn't as helpless as they thought. I didn't open the vault again, not yet, but I started imagining what it would be like to use them. To stand up, not with shouts or tears, but with quiet, unshakable strength. Rose noticed the change in me. One afternoon as we sat with our tea, she tilted her head and said, "You're different, Lena. Like you're carrying something new." I smiled, surprised she could see it. "Maybe I am," I said, and left it at that. But she was right. The spark had grown into a flame, small but steady. I wasn't ready to act, not yet, but I was starting to believe I could. That I could be more than the woman they'd reduced me to. That I could be Lena again, not just David's mother, not just Tom's widow, but me. The library. Rose, the scarf. The notebook, they were small things, but they were enough to keep me going. Enough to make me start asking questions I hadn't dared to ask before. What did I want? Not for David, not for Sarah, but for me. What kind of life did I deserve? The answers weren't clear, but the questions themselves felt like a gift. They reminded me that I still had a voice even if it was quiet. And that voice was growing louder, whispering that the second vault wasn't just a secret. It was a key to what I wasn't sure yet, but I was starting to believe I'd find out. The flame inside me grew, but it wasn't a fire that roared. It was steady, like a candle in a dark room, casting just enough light to see the edges of things I'd forgotten. I started to carry myself differently, even if David and Sarah didn't notice. I'd catch my reflection in the bathroom mirror, my gray hair pulled back, my eyes still bright despite the lines around them, and I'd think, "That's Lena. She's still here." It was a quiet realization, but it anchored me. I wasn't ready to open the second vault again to face the full weight of those papers, but I knew they were there waiting. And that knowledge gave me something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of control. I kept going to the library, my walks there becoming a ritual. The ache in my hips didn't bother me as much anymore. The rhythm of my steps felt like a conversation with myself. Rose was always there, shelving books or sipping tea, her presence a comfort I hadn't known I needed. We'd talk for hours, our voices low, so we wouldn't disturb the other patrons. I told her more about David, about the way his laugh had cut me, about Sarah's coldness. I even told her about the jewelry, how it wasn't just about the stones, but the stories they held. She listened with that same steadiness, her eyes holding mine, and when I was done, she said, "Lena, you're not just holding on to things. You're holding on to you. Don't let anyone take that away." Her words sank deep, like roots finding soil. I started to see my life through a different lens, not as a series of losses, but as a story I was still writing. I'd always been the one to fix things, to smooth over arguments, to make sure everyone else was okay. But now I was starting to ask, what about me? It was a question I hadn't allowed myself in years, and it felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I began to do more than just wear my mother's ring or hum Tom's song. I started making plans, small ones at first, but plans nonetheless. I called Clara again, not just to catch up, but to ask her advice about money, about options. She was surprised I'd never been one to talk about finances, but she didn't pry. "You sound different, Lena," she said. "Stronger." I didn't feel strong, not yet, but hearing her say it made me want to believe it. One afternoon, while David and Sarah were out, I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook. I'd been writing more, not just memories, but ideas. Things I wanted to do, places I wanted to see. I wrote about the ocean, how I hadn't been to the coast since Tom died, how I missed the sound of waves. I wrote about the garden I used to have, the roses I'd tended until we lost the house. I even wrote about the jewelry, what each piece meant, why I couldn't let it go. Writing it down made it real, like I was giving myself permission to want things again. I was so lost in my thoughts that I didn't hear Sarah come home. She walked into the kitchen, her heels clicking, and stopped when she saw me. "What are you writing?" She asked, her tone curious but edged with something sharp. I closed the notebook, my heart racing. Just thoughts, I said, keeping my voice even. She raised an eyebrow like she didn't believe me, but she didn't push. Instead, she set her purse on the counter and said, "We're having dinner with David's boss tomorrow. You don't need to cook." It wasn't an invitation, and we both knew it. I nodded, swallowing the sting, and she left the room. But as I sat there, my hands still on the notebook, I felt that flame flicker brighter. She hadn't invited me, but I hadn't expected her to. And for the first time, I realized I didn't care. I didn't need their approval to exist. That moment pushed me to do something bolder. The next day, while they were at their fancy dinner, I went to the bank. Not David's bank, I wasn't ready for him to know, but a small one downtown, where I'd kept a savings account. Tom and I had opened years ago. It wasn't much, just a few $1,000s, but it was mine. I sat across from a young teller, a kind woman named Maria, and asked about my options. Could I move the money, invest it, use it to start something new? She was patient, explaining things I hadn't thought about in years. I didn't make any decisions that day, but I left with a folder of information and a feeling I hadn't had in a long time possibility. When I got home, I hid the folder in the closet next to the second vault. I didn't tell Rose about the bank visit, not because I didn't trust her, but because it felt too fragile, like a dream I wasn't ready to share. But I did tell her about the notebook, about the ocean and the roses and the things I was starting to want. She smiled, her eyes crinkling. "You're blooming, Lena," she said. "It's slow, but it's happening." I laughed, embarrassed, but her words stayed with me. Blooming. I hadn't thought of myself that way in years, but maybe she was right. Maybe I was starting to grow again, even if it was just a sprout pushing through cracked earth. The tension in the house was growing, though. Sarah was colder, her sighs louder, her glances sharper. David was busier, always on his phone, barely looking at me when we passed in the hall. One evening, I overheard them arguing in their bedroom, their voices muffled but heated. "We need to deal with it," Sarah said. "The jewelry, the room, all of it." David's response was too low to hear, but the word burden slipped through clear as a bell. I stood in my doorway, my heart pounding, and realized they weren't just talking about my things. They were talking about me. About moving me out, maybe to a facility, maybe to somewhere cheaper, smaller, out of their way. The fear came first, cold and heavy, but then the anger returned, hotter than before. I went to my room and opened the closet, not the safe under the bed, but the second vault. I didn't take anything out, just sat there staring at it, my hands steady for the first time in days. Those papers weren't just a secret. They were a shield, a sword, a way to remind them who I was. I didn't know how I'd use them, not yet, but the thought of them gave me courage. I started wearing Tom's watch, the one he'd worn every day, until he got sick. It was too big for my wrist, but its weight felt right, like he was with me whispering, "You've got this, Lena." I kept going to the library, kept talking to Rose, kept writing in my notebook. I called Clara again this time, asking about lawyers, about wills, about protecting what was mine. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Lena, what's going on?" I didn't tell her everything, just enough to let her know I was taking steps. "I'm figuring out who I am again," I said, and she laughed a warm, proud sound. "About time," she said. I smiled even though she couldn't see it and felt that flame burn brighter. The small acts were adding up, each one a step towards something bigger. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building. Not a wall, not a cage, but a foundation. I started looking at apartments online, not because I was ready to leave, but because I wanted to know I could. I researched community gardens, wondering if I could plant roses again. I even wrote a letter to David, not one I'd send, but one that said everything I felt, how his laugh had broken me, how I'd given him everything, how I deserved better. I burned it in the backyard, watching the flames curl the paper, and felt lighter, like I'd let go of something heavy. Rose saw it all, even the things I didn't say. One day, as we sat with our tea, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're not just blooming, Lena," she said. You're becoming." I didn't know what she meant, not exactly, but I felt it. I was changing not into someone new, but into someone I'd always been, someone I'd buried under years of sacrifice and silence. And the second vault, with its papers and its secrets, was part of that becoming. I wasn't ready to open it, not yet, but I knew I would. Soon. The shift in me was slow, like the turning of seasons, but it was real. I could feel it in the way I walked to the library now, my steps surer, my head a little higher. I could see it in the mirror, in the way my eyes held a glint of something fierce, something I thought I'd lost. The flame inside me wasn't just a flicker anymore. It was a steady glow warming the parts of me that had gone cold. I still hadn't opened the second vault again, hadn't touched those papers since that first time, but their existence was enough. They were a promise, a reminder that I had more power than David or Sarah realized, more than I'd realized myself. I kept up my small acts of defiance, each one a thread weaving me back together. I wore Tom's watch every day now, its heavy tick a heartbeat against my wrist. I bought a small potted rose at the nursery, a soft pink one, and set it on my windowsill. Sarah noticed it and frowned, muttering something about clutter, but I didn't care. I tended it every morning, whispering to it like it could hear me, and it thrived. I wrote more in my notebook, not just dreams, but plans, real ones. I called Clara again this time, asking about real estate agents, about what it would take to find a place of my own. She didn't push for details, but her voice was warm, encouraging. "You're sounding like the old Lena," she said, "the one who never backed down." I laughed soft and surprised because I was starting to feel like her too. The tension in the house was thicker now, like a fog that clung to everything. Sarah's patience was gone. She didn't bother hiding her irritation anymore. If I lingered in the kitchen, she'd sigh loudly, slamming cabinets. David was distant, his eyes always on his phone, his answers short when I tried to talk. I overheard them again one night, their voices sharp through the walls. "We can't keep doing this," Sarah said. "She's taking up space, money, everything." David murmured something, then said, "We'll figure it out. After the baby." After the baby. Like I was a task to be checked off, a problem to be solved once their real life began. I lay in bed, my hands clenched, and felt that flame burn hotter. Not with rage, but with resolve. I decided it was time to do more than plan. The next morning, I went back to the bank, this time with a purpose. Maria, the teller, remembered me and smiled as I sat down. I told her I wanted to move my savings to put it somewhere David couldn't touch. I didn't tell her why, but she didn't ask. She helped me open a new account, one in my name only, and transfer the money. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to feel like a start. I asked about investments, about turning that small sum into something more. She gave me pamphlets, names of financial advisors, and a quiet confidence that made me believe I could do this. When I left, I felt lighter, like I'd taken a piece of myself back. That afternoon, I called a lawyer. Not one from David's world, but one Clara recommended, a woman named Susan who specialized in estate planning. I was nervous, my voice shaky, as I explained what I wanted to protect my assets, to make sure my wishes were clear. Susan was kind but direct, asking questions I hadn't thought about in years. Did I have a will? Who were my beneficiaries? What did I own? I didn't mention the second vault, not yet, but I told her about the jewelry, the savings, the things I wanted to keep safe. She didn't rush me, didn't make me feel small. By the end of the call, I had an appointment to meet her in person and a sense that I was building something solid, something mine. I didn't tell Rose everything, but I told her enough. We were at the library, tucked in our usual corner, the scent of old books and tea between us. I told her about the bank, the lawyer, the rose on my windowsill. Her eyes lit up and she leaned forward, her voice low. "Lena, you're not just taking steps, you're claiming your life." I blushed, embarrassed by the pride in her voice, but I couldn't deny it. I was claiming something even if I wasn't sure what it looked like yet. I showed her my notebook, the pages filled with dreams and plans, and she read them slowly, her fingers tracing the words. "This is beautiful," she said. "This is you." The rose on my windowsill became a symbol not just of growth, but of defiance. I started planting more, not in the ground, Sarah would never allow that, but in pots I kept in my room. A white one for Tom, a red one for my mother, a yellow one for the life I was starting to imagine. I'd water them, prune them, talk to them, and they bloomed, filling my room with color and scent. Sarah complained once, saying they made the house smell like a funeral parlor, but I just smiled and said I liked them. It was the first time I'd stood my ground without apologizing, and the look on her face, surprise, maybe a flicker of respect, felt like a victory. I started reaching out more, not just to Clara, but to old friends I'd lost touch with. I called Mary, who'd been my neighbor when David was young, and we talked for an hour, laughing about the time our kids stole apples from her tree. I emailed Joan, a college friend, and we planned to meet for coffee next month. Each call, each connection was a reminder that I wasn't just David's mother or Sarah's burden. I was Lena, with a life that stretched beyond their walls. I even joined a book club at the library thanks to Rose. It was small, just 6 women, but they welcomed me like I'd always belonged. We read Their Eyes Were Watching God, and I found myself speaking up, sharing thoughts I hadn't voiced in years. The other women listened, nodded, and one even said, "Lena, you should write a book." I laughed, but the idea stuck like a seed planted in soft earth. The second vault was always in the back of my mind, its contents a quiet hum beneath my days. I didn't need to open it to know what was there to feel its power, but I started preparing in small ways for the moment I'd use it. I made copies of my important papers, the ones in the safe under the bed, and stored them with Susan. I wrote a new will, not final yet, but a draft that made my wishes clear. I even started looking at properties online, not big houses, but small cottages, places where I could have a garden, a view, a life. I wasn't ready to leave David's house, not yet, but knowing I could was enough to keep me moving forward. The tension at home was unbearable now. Sarah stopped speaking to me unless she had to, her silence louder than her sighs. David was worse, his impatience sharp as a blade. One night he came to my room, his face tight. "Mom, we need to talk about the jewelry," he said. "We're serious about selling it. The baby's coming soon and we need the money." I looked at him, my son, the boy I'd rocked to sleep, and felt a strange calm. "We'll talk," I said, my voice steady. "But not tonight." He stared at me, surprised, then nodded and left. I sat on my bed, my hands on Tom's watch, and felt the flame inside me burn bright. I wasn't ready to show them the second vault, not yet, but I was closer. I could feel it like a storm gathering on the horizon, quiet but inevitable. Rose saw it too. The next day at the library, she looked at me and said, "You're ready for something, aren't you?" I didn't answer, just smiled, but she knew. She squeezed my hand and said, "Whatever it is, Lena, you've got it in you." I believed her not because I was strong, but because I was becoming someone who could face the storm, who could open the vault, who could stand in her own truth. The roses on my windowsill bloomed brighter, and I knew deep in my bones that I was almost ready to bloom too. The air in the house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. David's words about the jewelry lingered a challenge I hadn't answered, but hadn't ignored either. I could see it in his eyes when he looked at me now, a flicker of unease, like he sensed the change in me but couldn't name it. Sarah was worse. Her silence had turned to sharp glances, her movements brusque, like I was a stain she couldn't scrub out. But I wasn't shrinking anymore. The flame inside me was steady, its warmth spreading, and I carried it like a secret, a strength they couldn't touch. My roses bloomed on the windowsill, their petals soft but defiant, and I tended them with a quiet pride. They were mine, just like the plans I was making, the life I was building. It was. I met with Susan the lawyer in person for the first time. Her office was small, cluttered with books and files, but it felt safe, like a place where truths could be spoken. I brought the papers from the safe under the bed, not the ones from the second vault, not yet, and laid them out. My will, the deed to the jewelry, the new bank account. Susan read through them, her glasses perched on her nose, and asked questions that made me think. Who did I want to protect? What did I want my legacy to be? I told her about David, about Sarah, about the way they'd made me feel small. I told her about the jewelry, how it wasn't just about money, but memory, love, a life they didn't understand. She listened, her pen still, and when I was done, she said, Lena, you're not just protecting your assets, you're protecting yourself. That's a powerful thing. We worked for hours drafting a new will, one that made my wishes clear. I left the jewelry to Clara's daughter, my niece Emily, who'd always loved my stories about the pieces. I set aside money for charity for the library that had become my sanctuary. I even included a small trust for David's baby, not because I owed him, but because I wanted to, because love doesn't vanish, even when it hurts. Susan didn't rush me, didn't make me feel foolish for my choices. When we finished, I felt lighter, like I'd shed a weight I hadn't known I was carrying. I didn't tell her about the second vault, but I knew it was part of the bigger plan I was forming. Not revenge, not spite, but justice. A way to stand in my truth. I kept going to the library, my talks with Rose a lifeline. I told her about Susan, about the will, about the roses. She listened, her eyes bright, and said, You're not just claiming your life, Lena. You're rewriting it. I smiled, the words settling deep. Rewriting. That's what it felt like, not erasing the past, but adding new chapters, ones where I was the hero, not the shadow. I showed her a new page in my notebook where I'd sketched a garden, not just roses, but lavender daisies, a place I could build if I had my own home. She traced the lines with her finger and said, This is going to be real one day. I can feel it. The book club was another anchor. We finished, Their Eyes Were Watching God, and started The House of Mirth. And I found myself speaking more, my voice stronger. The other women, Mary Ellen, Patricia, and the others listened, their nods and smiles making me feel seen. One night, after we'd discussed Lily Bart's tragic choices, Patricia said, Lena, you've got a way of seeing things. You should tell your story. I laughed, but the idea took root like the roses in my room. Not a book, not yet, but this. Talking to you, sharing what I've been through. It felt right, like a way to honor the woman I was becoming. I started doing more than planning. I contacted a real estate agent, a quiet woman named Linda who specialized in small properties. I told her I wasn't ready to buy just looking, but she didn't push. She sent me listings, cottages, bungalows, places with gardens and light. I'd sit at the library scrolling through them on my phone, imagining myself in a kitchen with sun streaming in roses outside the window. It wasn't about leaving David's house, not yet, but about knowing I could. Each listing was a possibility, a reminder that I had choices. The second vault was always there, a quiet hum in my mind. I didn't open it, but I checked the panel in the closet, making sure it was secure. I started to think about what those papers meant, not just as documents, but as power. They were proof of something David and Sarah didn't know, something that could change everything. I wasn't ready to use them, but I was preparing. I made a list in my notebook, not of dreams, but of steps. Meet with Susan again. Talk to Linda, call Clara about visiting. Each step was a brick building, something stronger than the fear that had held me for so long. The tension at home was a constant now, like a string pulled too tight. David brought up the jewelry again, his voice sharp. Mom, we're not asking. We're selling it. You need to let go. I looked at him, my son, and felt a strange calm. I heard you. I said, my voice steady. But it's my decision. He blinked, caught off guard, and for a moment I saw the boy he used to be, the one who'd cling to me when he was scared. But then he shook his head and left, and I knew that boy was gone. Sarah was worse. She stopped pretending to care. One day she left a pamphlet on the kitchen table, bright, glossy, advertising a senior living facility. She didn't say anything, but the message was clear. I picked it up, my hand steady, and threw it in the trash. The flame inside me burned brighter. I started wearing my mother's sapphire necklace not just to the grocery store, but at home, its weight a reminder of who I was. Sarah noticed her eyes narrowing, but she didn't say anything. I wore it to the library, to book club, to my meeting with Linda. It wasn't about showing off, it was about claiming myself piece by piece. I bought a new dress, simple but elegant, and wore it to the book club, feeling the fabric against my skin like a second chance. Patricia said, "Lena, you look radiant," and I believed her not because I was vain, but because I was starting to see it myself. I called Clara and told her I was thinking of visiting, maybe staying for a while. She was thrilled, her voice bubbling with plans. "You can have the guest room," she said. "We'll plant roses together." I laughed, the sound surprising me, and realized I hadn't laughed like that in months. I started packing a small bag, not to leave, but to be ready to know I could walk out if I needed to. I put Tom's watch in it, the sapphire necklace, my notebook. The roses stayed on the windowsill, blooming brighter as if they knew I was close to something big. Rose saw it too. We were at the library, our tea cold, and she looked at me, her eyes searching. "You're almost there, aren't you?" she said. I nodded, not sure what there was, but feeling it like a door I was about to open. "I think so," I said, and she smiled, her hand on mine. "You're going to be okay, Lena. More than okay." I believed her not because I was fearless, but because I was ready. Ready to face David, Sarah, the vault, the truth. The flame inside me was a fire, now quiet but fierce, and I knew deep in my bones that I was about to step into it. The fire inside me was no longer a secret I kept from myself. It burned steady, its heat, guiding me through the days, giving me clarity I hadn't known I could reclaim. I moved through David and Sarah's house like a guest who knew her welcome was wearing thin, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I was preparing not just for a confrontation, but for a life beyond their walls. The roses on my windowsill bloomed fiercer, their petals, a quiet rebellion, and I tended them with a love that felt like a promise. The second vault weighted its contents, a weight I was almost ready to carry, but I didn't rush. I was building something, not just a plan, but a self, and every step mattered. I met with Susan again this time with a clearer sense of what I wanted. We finalized the will, and I added a letter, not legal, but personal, explaining why I'd made my choices. I wrote about the jewelry, how it wasn't just stones, but stories, and why I'd given it to Emily. I wrote about the library, how it had saved me, and why I'd left money for its programs. I even wrote about David, not with anger, but with truth, how he'd hurt me, how I loved him still, how I hoped he'd understand one day. Susan read it, her eyes soft, and said, "This is more than a will, Lena. It's a testament." I knotted my throat tight because that's what it felt like, a record of who I was, who I'd become. I started visiting properties with Linda, the real estate agent. Not to buy, not yet, but to see what was possible. We toured a small cottage on the edge of town, its garden overgrown but full of potential. I walked through the rooms, imagining my roses in the yard, my books on the shelves, my life in the light. Linda didn't push, just let me dream, and when we left, she said, "This one feels like you." I smiled, not committing, but holding the idea close. I could see it now, a home of my own, not as a rebellion, but as a gift to myself. I took pictures of the cottage, tucked them into my notebook, and wrote about the garden. I'd plant roses, lavender, maybe a lilac bush for Tom. The book club became a sanctuary, each meeting a reminder that I belonged somewhere. We were reading The Awakening now, and I found myself drawn to Edna's struggle, her search for a self no one else could define. I spoke up more, my voice steady, and the other women listened, their eyes warm. After one meeting, Ellen pulled me aside and said, "Lena, you've changed. You're brighter." I laughed, surprised, but I felt it. I was brighter not because the pain was gone, but because I was carrying it differently with a strength I hadn't known I had. I told them about the cottage not as a plan, but as a dream, and they cheered me on their voices, a chorus of belief. I kept in touch with Clara, planning my visit. She sent me pictures of her garden full of roses and herbs, and I could almost smell them through the screen. We talked about the past, about our mother, about the sapphire necklace I wore every day now. I told her about Susan, about the will, about the cottage. She listened, her voice steady, and said, "Lena, you're not just surviving, you're living." I cried then, not from sadness, but from the truth of it. I was living not just for David or Sarah or even Tom, but for me. I packed more for the visit, adding my mother's emerald ring, a photo of Tom, the notebook that held my heart. The tension at home was a blade now sharp and close. Sarah's pamphlet about the senior living facility wasn't the last. I found another on my bed, this one, with a note in her handwriting. "We should talk." I burned it in the backyard, the flames curling the paper, and felt no guilt. David was colder, his words clipped. One evening, he cornered me in the kitchen, his face tight. "Mom, we're selling the jewelry. It's done. We've got a buyer." I looked at him, my son, and felt the fire inside me flare. "No," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You don't get to decide that." He stared, his mouth open, then shook his head and walked away. I stood there, my hands steady, and knew I was ready for the next step. I went to the library the next day, my heart heavy but sure. Rose was there, shelving books, and when she saw me, she stopped. "Lena," she said, "what's happened?" I told her about David, about the buyer, about the pamphlet. I told her about the cottage, the will, the life I was building. I didn't mention the second vault, but I didn't need to. She saw the fire in me, the resolve. She took my hands and said, "You're not just rewriting your story. You're finishing it on your terms." I nodded, tears in my eyes, because she was right. I was finishing something not with anger, but with truth. I started preparing for the confrontation, not with shouts, but with quiet choices. I moved the safe from under the bed to the closet next to the second vault and checked the panel to make sure it was secure. I made copies of the vault's papers, not to use yet, but to have them ready. I called Susan and asked about trusts, about protecting what was mine in ways David couldn't touch. She gave me options, her voice calm, and I felt the fire grow. I even talked to Linda about the cottage, not just as a dream, but as a possibility. "I'm thinking about it," I said, and she smiled, knowing I meant it. I wore the sapphire necklace every day now, its weight a shield. I wore Tom's watch, the emerald ring, the new dress. I walked to the library with my head high, my steps sure. I laughed with the book club, planned with Clara, dreamed with Rose. Each moment was a brick building, a life they couldn't take away. I started writing a letter, not for the will, but for myself, a record of what I'd been through, what I'd learned. I wrote about David's laugh, Sarah's coldness, the roses, the vault. I wrote about the woman I'd been, the woman I was becoming. It wasn't for anyone else, just me, a way to see myself clearly. The final push came unexpectedly. I came home one afternoon to find Sarah in my room, the closet door open. She wasn't touching anything, just standing there, but the sight of her in my space near the vault made my blood run cold. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharp. She turned her face blank. "Just checking for dust. This room's a mess." It wasn't, and we both knew it. She left, but the fear stayed hot and urgent. That night, I opened the second vault not to take anything, but to look, to remind myself what was there. The jewelry, diamond brooch, gold locket glinted in the dim light, but it was the papers that mattered. Tom's handwriting steady and sure, spelling out a truth David and Sarah didn't know. I closed the vault, my hands steady, and knew it was time. I didn't act right away. I went to the library, talked to Rose, wrote in my notebook. I called Clara, told her I was coming soon. I met with Susan, finalized the trust. I even went back to the cottage, walked the garden again, and told Linda I'd make an offer soon. Each step was a thread weaving a net to catch me when I fell. because I knew I would fall not from weakness, but from the weight of what was coming. The second vault wasn't just a secret anymore. It was a key, and I was ready to turn it. Not with malice, not with vengeance, but with the quiet strength of a woman who'd found herself again. Rose saw it. The book club saw it. Clara heard it in my voice. "You're ready?" Rose set her hand on mine, and I nodded the fire inside me, a blaze now quiet but fierce. I looked at my roses, their petals bright, and knew they weren't just surviving. They were thriving like me. The second vault waited, and I was ready to open it to show them the truth, to stand in my power. Not tomorrow, not next week, but soon. Very soon. The moment I'd been building toward arrived like a storm that had been gathering for months, quiet at first, then undeniable. I woke that morning with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, the fire inside me no longer just a blaze but a beacon guiding me forward. My roses stood bright on the windowsill, their petals catching the dawn, and I touched them gently as if drawing strength from their roots. Today was the day. Not because I'd planned it, not because I'd chosen it, but because it was time. The second vault, the papers, the truth, they weren't just waiting anymore. They were calling. David and Sarah had been relentless the past few days. The pamphlets for senior living facilities multiplied left on the kitchen counter. My nightstand even slipped under my door. Their voices grew sharper, their patience gone. Last night, David had come to my room, his face hard, his words final. "Mom, the buyer's coming tomorrow. We're selling the jewelry. It's for the baby, for our family." He'd emphasized our family, as if I wasn't part of it, as if my place in his life had expired. Sarah stood behind him, her arms crossed, her eyes cold. I'd looked at them, my son and his wife, and felt no fear, only a calm resolve. "We'll talk tomorrow," I said, my voice steady. David's jaw tightened, but he nodded and left Sarah following like a shadow. I'd lain awake that night, Tom's watch ticking on my wrist, and known what I had to do. I rose early before they were awake and dressed with care. I wore the sapphire necklace, the emerald ring, Tom's watch, the new dress that made me feel like myself. I watered my roses, whispering to them as if they could hear, and packed a small bag. My notebook, a photo of Tom, the papers from the safe under the bed. I checked the second vault, not opening it, but touching the panel, feeling its weight. I called Susan, left a message saying I might need her soon. I texted Clara, told her I was ready to visit. I even emailed Linda saying I wanted to make an offer on the cottage. Each act was a thread tying me to the life I'd built, the woman I'd become. When David and Sarah came downstairs, I was in the living room, the velvet box with the jewelry on the coffee table. They stopped surprised to see me there. The box opened, the sapphire necklace gleaming in the light. "You said the buyer's coming," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Let's talk." David glanced at Sarah, then sat, his posture stiff. Sarah stayed standing, her arms crossed, her eyes narrow. "Good," David said. "You're finally being reasonable." I smiled, not with warmth, but with something else, something they didn't recognize. "I've always been reasonable," I said, "but you haven't listened." I opened the velvet box wider, letting them see the jewelry, my mother's necklace, my grandmother's ring, Tom's pearl earrings. "You think these are just things," I said, my voice low, steady. "You think they're money for your future, for your baby, but they're my past, my heart, my life. You laughed when I cried, David. You called me dramatic, but you don't know me. You never did." David shifted, uncomfortable, but Sarah scoffed, her voice sharp. "Lena, this is about priorities. The baby comes first." I looked at her, my eyes steady, and said, "I know about priorities. I raised a son. I buried a husband. I gave everything. But you don't get to decide what's mine." I stood, my hands steady, and walked to my room. They followed, confused, their voices rising. "Mom." "What are you doing?" David called. I didn't answer. I knelt by the closet, pried open the panel, and opened the second vault. The click of the lock was loud in the silence. and I felt their eyes on me, their confusion turning to unease. I took out the jewelry first, the diamond brooch. The gold locket set them aside. Then I took out the papers, Tom's handwriting, clear and steady, and held them up. You thought the safe under the bed was all I had. I said, my voice calm but unyielding. You thought I was just an old woman with old things. But you were wrong. I handed David the papers, watching his face as he read. His eyes widened, his hands trembling. Sarah leaned over, her breath catching. The papers weren't just documents. They were the deed to this house in my name, not theirs. They were the trust Tom had set up, the one that funded David's college, his car, his life, the one I controlled. They were proof that I wasn't a guest, a burden, a shadow. I was the foundation. This house, I said, is mine. The money you've been living on, mine. You didn't ask, didn't care, didn't see. You laughed when I cried David. You called me selfish Sarah. But I've been carrying you both, and you never knew. The room was silent, their faces pale, their certainty shattered. David tried to speak, his voice hoarse. Mom, we thought. I held up a hand, stopping him. You thought I was nothing. I said, not with anger, but with truth. You thought I was in the way, but I'm not. I'm Lena, and I'm done letting you forget that. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't soften. I didn't need to. The fire inside me burned bright, not with vengeance, but with dignity, the kind that doesn't need to shout. I gathered the papers, the jewelry, and closed the vault. The buyer isn't coming, I said. The jewelry stays with me, and you'll stay in this house for now because I'm not cruel. But things are going to change. You'll respect me. My space, my choices, or you'll find somewhere else to live. David nodded, his face ashen, and Sarah looked away, her hands clenched. I walked past them, my head high, and went to my room, closing the door softly. I sat by my roses, their scent filling the air, and felt a peace I hadn't known in years. They didn't speak to me for the rest of the day, and I didn't seek them out. I called Rose, told her what had happened, and she laughed, a warm, proud sound. Lena, you didn't just stand up. You soared. I smiled, tears in my eyes, because I felt it. I called Clara, told her I was coming next week, and she cheered. I emailed Susan, thanked her for her help, and Linda confirming the offer on the cottage. I wrote in my notebook not about the confrontation, but about the future, the garden, the life I'd build. The flame inside me was a light now, steady and sure, and I knew I'd carry it forward. David knocked on my door that night, his voice soft. Mom, can we talk? I let him in, my face calm. He apologized, stumbling over his words, promising to do better. I listened, not forgiving yet, but open, because love is complicated, and I still loved him even now. Sarah stayed away, but I didn't care. I'd shown them who I was, and that was enough. I slept soundly that night, Tom's watch on my wrist, my roses blooming, the second vault secure. I wasn't just Lena, the mother, the widow, the burden. I was Lena, whole and unbroken, and I was ready for whatever came next. The days after I opened the second vault felt like the quiet after a storm, the air clear, but charged with the memory of what had passed. The house was different now, not because the walls had changed, but because I had. I moved through it with a certainty I hadn't known in years, my steps light, my heart steady. The roses on my windowsill bloomed brighter, their petals a testament to the care I'd given them, to the care I was giving myself. David and Sarah were subdued, their voices softer, their glances cautious. They didn't bring up the jewelry again, didn't leave pamphlets or talk about buyers. The power had shifted, not with shouts or tears, but with the quiet truth I'd laid bare. I didn't gloat, didn't need to. I'd shown them who I was, and that was enough. I spent the next week tying up loose ends, each act a step toward the life I was building. I met with Linda and signed the papers for the cottage, my hands steady as I wrote my name. It wasn't a grand place, just a small bungalow with a garden waiting to be loved, but it was mine. I could see it already: roses by the fence, lavender near the door, a chair where I'd read in the evenings. I told Rose about it at the library, my voice bright, and she hugged me, her eyes shining. "Lena, you're not just moving," she said. "You're home." I nodded, tears pricking my eyes, because she was right. I was finding my home not just in the cottage, but in myself. I visited Clara, spending a week in her house surrounded by her roses and her warmth. We talked late into the night, laughing about our childhood, crying about the years we'd lost to distance. I told her about the vault, the papers, the confrontation. She listened, her hand on mine, and said, "You didn't just stand up, Lena. You rebuilt yourself." I smiled, the words settling deep, and we planted a rose in her garden, a soft pink one to mark the moment. I wore my mother's sapphire necklace, Tom's watch, and felt them with me, their love, a thread that hadn't broken. Back at David's house, I started packing, not with haste, but with purpose. I took my roses, my notebook, the jewelry, the photos of Tom. I didn't take much else. The guest room had never been mine, not really. David watched me one evening, his face uncertain. "Mom, you don't have to go," he said, his voice low. I looked at him, my son, and saw the boy he'd been, the man he was trying to become. "I know," I said, my voice gentle, "but I want to." He nodded, his eyes damp, and I didn't push for more. Forgiveness would come, or it wouldn't, but I didn't need it to move forward. I was enough. Sarah was different. Her silence not cold now, but awkward, like she didn't know how to face me. One morning she knocked on my door, her hands twisting. "Lena," she said, her voice halting, "I'm sorry for everything." I looked at her, saw the weight in her eyes, and nodded. "I hear you," I said, not warm, but not harsh. I didn't owe her absolution, but I didn't need to carry resentment either. I let it go like a leaf on the wind and felt lighter for it. She left, and I went back to packing my roses, catching the light. I joined the book club for one last meeting before I moved, reading The Awakening with the women who'd become my friends. We talked about Edna, about choices, about freedom. I told them about the cottage, the garden, the life I was starting. They cheered, their voices a chorus of pride, and Ellen said, "Lena, you're our hero." I laughed, embarrassed, but I felt it not as pride, but as truth. I wasn't a hero, just a woman who'd found her way, but that was enough. I gave each of them a cutting from my roses, a piece of my heart to carry forward. The day I moved, I stood in the guest room, empty now, except for my roses and my bag. David and Sarah helped load the car, their movements quiet, their eyes avoiding mine. I didn't say much, just thanked them, and drove to the cottage, the sapphire necklace warm against my skin. When I arrived, the garden was waiting, overgrown but full of promise. I set my roses on the porch, opened the door, and stepped inside. The air smelled of wood and light, and I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. I was home. I spent the first weeks planting not just roses, but lavender daisies, a lilac bush for Tom. I hung photos of my parents, my sister, my husband, my life. I wrote in my notebook not just plans, but stories, pieces of myself I wanted to keep. I joined a new book club in town, made friends with my neighbors, called Clara every week. I even started volunteering at the local library, shelving books like Rose, my hands steady as I worked. Life wasn't perfect. There were lonely nights, moments when David's laugh echoed in my mind, but it was mine, and that was enough. One evening, I sat in my garden, a cup of tea in my hands, the roses blooming around me. I took off the sapphire necklace, held it to the light, and thought of my mother, her strength, her love. I didn't need to wear it every day anymore. It was part of me, like Tom's watch, like the fire that had carried me here. I decided to give it to Emily not as a gift, but as a legacy, a reminder that our worth isn't in what we own, but in who we are. I wrapped it in velvet, wrote her a letter, and sent it, my heart full. I lit a candle that night, not for loss, but for life, its flame steady like the one inside me. I thought of David, of Sarah, of the vault of the woman I'd been and the woman I'd become. I didn't hate them, didn't need to. I'd shown them my truth, and that was enough. I looked at my roses, their petals soft in the dusk, and knew I was at peace. Not because I'd won, not because I'd fought, but because I'd chosen myself. And so, to you listening to my story, I want to say this. Your worth isn't measured by who accepts you, who sees you, who stays. It's measured by how you choose to honor yourself, how you tend the roses in your heart, how you walk through the fire and come out whole. I'm Lena, and I'm here in my garden, in my home, in my life, and I'm enough.